Right. Excuse me. Let's say my name is Bob Wiggins. I'm chair of Give a Kidney, a charity devoted to raising awareness of particularly non-directed living kidney donation. We do that by awareness campaigns and working with NHSBT and other partners. We also support donors either that are thinking about donating, in the process of donating, or they've already have donated. So that's what we do. So we've had a series of webinars and information sessions through COVID. Normally we have an annual conference, which is our major event, but like everyone else, we've adapted to changing times. We're recording the session, just so you're aware. The attendees won't be seen, so whether you've got your video on or off, you won't be seen. The recording will be made available shortly after this webinar for people that may want to come back to it or that haven't seen it. We have a Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. There should be a Q&A button, which you're welcome to ask questions through the session, and we'll pick those up after the presentation. You can ask questions anonymously or not, as the case may be. Very pleased to have Lisa Mumford, who's head of organ donation and transplantation studies with NHS Blood and Transplant. And in that role, she oversees all the studies regarding transplantation. This evening, we're looking at the Living Kidney Sharing Scheme, which has been just a huge success in the impact it's had on kidney donations over the last number of years, and only through an awful lot of effort on the part of NHSBT to make that work. So Lisa's going to be telling us about that, and I look forward to that. We have another session about the called Making a Match, the science of transplantation, and how matches are made, on May the 22nd. I believe that's a Saturday morning. So hopefully you can join us for that as well. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn over to you, Lisa, now.
Thank you, Bob. So I'll just share my screen to get the presentation started. Okay, so today, as Bob said, I'm going to talk about an introduction to and the evolution of the UK Kidney Sharing Scheme. As was said, I am head of ODT studies. I'm a statistician at NHS Blood and Transplant and have been involved in this scheme over the years to get it to where it is today. So just an outline of the presentation. So I'm going to give an introduction, then look at the development of the current UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme, look at activity, and then a brief section at the end of the impact of COVID-19. So starting with the introduction. So if we look at living kidney or living donor kidney transplant rates comparing to our European, Australian and United States colleagues, we can see that in the UK in 2019, there were 15.3 transplants performed for every 1 million population in the UK. And that was third only to the Netherlands and the United States. If we look back to 2010, that is a reduction on where we were in 2010. We actually did 16.6 per million population, but actually we were a lot lower down the list in terms of our European colleagues and only appearing in 6th position. So what is living kidney donation? Well, it's where a potential donor and recipient pair come together. And in this instance, we have a donor that cannot donate to their recipient because of blood group incompatibility or because of a positive cross-match. And approximately 20 to 30% of all possible living donor transplants can't go ahead because of these reasons. So if we look at the background of the scheme, so in September 2006, there was a change in legal framework by the Human Tissue Authority, and it meant that we could develop a national scheme, including a matching algorithm. In April 2007, the first paired exchange matching run took place, but also we had our first non-directed altruistic donation. And then since then, we've been reviewing and refining the sharing scheme. And I'll go through what the sharing scheme is. Looking at our UK living donor kidney transplants, we can see back in 2005 and 6, before the HTA made the announcement, the majority, if not all, transplants were related donors or unrelated donors. And as you can see from this chart, that changed since 2007, and we're now seeing more complexities in our living donor transplants. And actually, in the most recent year, you can see there that 164 transplants were performed through the paired exchange donor scheme and 94 non-directed altruistic donors. So let's take a look at the development of the current UK sharing scheme. So we started in a simple beginning. So in 2007, for the first year only, we had two-way exchanges. And this is where we have our donor and recipient from our first pair and our donor and recipient from our second pair. The donor from pair 1 donates to our recipient from pair 2, and the donor from pair 2 donates to our recipient from pair 1. And these, like I said before, are because of HLA or blood group incompatibility. In 2008, after the first year, we then introduced three-way exchanges. So that's where we now have 3 pairs, and they all donate so that the donor and recipient from different pairs swap kidneys. In 2012, we introduced changes to the scheme. So we introduced short altruistic donor chains. So this is where a non-directed altruistic donor could choose to donate to a pair in the pool, and then their donor would donate to a patient on the waiting list. We also allowed compatible pairs to join the scheme. So these are where a donor and a recipient are able to proceed with donation or with kidney donation to each other. However, they may choose that because there's a big age gap, or because the pairing, so the compatibility between the two, isn't quite as good, they can go into the scheme to get a better match. Patients can be registered for blood group and HLA incompatible transplant through the scheme also in 2012. So that means that if you are incompatible, you can go into the scheme and you can match and say, actually, I still want this transplant, but let's do give some drugs so that we allow this to go ahead. So further changes in 2015 and 2018. So we started in 2012 with our short altruistic donor chain. Then in 2015, we allowed a long altruistic donor chain. So this is where the altruistic donor would donate to the first pair, then their donor would donate to the second pair, and then that donor donates directly to the waiting list. Now, in these scenarios, prior to 2018, the altruistic donor had a choice as to whether they went into the sharing scheme or whether they donated direct to the waiting list. However, in 2018, chain donation is now the default option for altruistic donors, rather than giving an option for the direct to the waiting list. Now, if there is a high priority patient on the waiting list, the altruistic donor is directed to the waiting list, or if there are no matches in the scheme, then the altruistic donor can then donate to the waiting list, or they can wait till the next scheme is run. So how does that interaction with the kidney offering scheme work in terms of deceased donation? Well, in 2006, we had this scheme. So those in tiers A, B, C, and D were considered priority patients. So what that means is that where a priority patient appeared in the matching run, an altruistic donor would donate direct to the waiting list. We've now changed our kidney offering scheme in 2019, and we now have a simple 2-tier system. And tier A, which is our extremely difficult to match patients, so now they will be prioritised for an altruistic donor if there is one there. Only 15% of patients appear in this category, so it's quite unlikely that an altruistic donor gets matched here, but it gives these patients the chance of a transplant where they may otherwise not be able to get one. So what does the scheme today look like? Well, we have our 2-way exchanges. We also have our 3-way exchanges. We have our short altruistic donor chains and our long altruistic donor chains, and that makes up the scheme today. So how do we identify optimal combinations of each of these transplants? So we have over 200 pairs in every matching run. And this results in around 2,000 to 5,000 different arcs. So that's different donor to recipient matches, and that's illustrated in the picture on the right. So you can see that multiple donors can donate to multiple recipients, and multiple recipients receive kidneys from multiple donors. What we do is we weight these arcs to give a preference to certain matches, and I'll go on to how we weight those shortly. And what we try to do is seek to maximize the number of transplants according to these criteria within each matching run. And this matching run software was implemented by colleagues at University of Glasgow. And as you can see from this picture, which was given to us by Glasgow, this illustrates how many matches and combinations can go ahead, and it looks very messy and lots can happen. So what are the matching principles? Well, we maximize two-way exchanges. So we look to make sure that two-way exchanges happen first. And this is because a three-way exchange is more likely to fall down. However, we can get three-way exchanges with embedded two-way exchanges, so that if one of those matches fall down, then we can still proceed with another pair. We try to maximize the number of transplants, as already mentioned. We try to minimize the three-way exchanges, but maximize them where there is an embedded two-way and long chain. So that's, like I said, if we have anybody that falls down, we have another pair that won't miss out. And we also try to maximize the score of the set of transplants. And what I mean by the score, so this is based on all the recipients in the matching run. We look at how many previous matching runs a patient has been in and give them points for that. We look at the sensitization of the patient. So how difficult is that patient going to find a transplant? If they're very difficult to match, then we give them extra points. We look at the HLA mismatch of the identified transplant. So if you have a very good match, then you get extra points. If it's a poor match, then we try to remove that or make that slightly less possible, unless it is your only chance of a transplant. And we try to minimize the donor to donor age difference. So you get points or extra points if there is a smaller gap. So the UK scheme is currently the largest scheme in Europe, and we're part of a European network for collaboration on kidney exchange programs. So you can see there from the map the different colours. So we have large advanced programs in the Netherlands, in the UK, and also in Spain. There are smaller programs across the rest of Europe. We have some programs in development and some countries with no programs at all. But if you look at the number of recipients transplanted in blue and the newly registered patients in red, we can see that the UK has the largest number. And actually, if you combine all the other countries in Europe together, the UK still has more transplants than those. So we have great experience of this in the UK. And we want to be part of this programme because we want to share that experience with other European colleagues. So now I'm going to move on to talk about activity and in the scheme. So I'm just showing you this chart again. So we mentioned about the different types of transplants. What we can see in the most recent 5 and 6 years is that transplant activity has actually remained quite static. We did see a very large number of altruistic or non-directed altruistic donors in 2013-14. That was the most we had seen, 117. And then we did start to see a fall off of that, with only 62 coming forward in 2018-19. However, in 2019-20, that rose again to 94. We can see the paired exchange programme has also grown, with 164 transplants performed in the 2019-20 financial year. And actually, we're seeing reductions now in the related donor and unrelated donor, as well as the HLA incompatible and ABO incompatible donor pairs. If we look at the sex of adult recipients and donors, so these are transplants between 2014 and 2020. So in terms of paired donation, there's actually an even split between male and females in our recipient and our donor groups. The same is true for our non-altruistic donor groups. In terms of the living related, our recipients tend to be more male and our donors tend to be more female. In the HLA incompatible group, in terms of both donor and recipients, we see more females, whereas in the ABO incompatible group, we see more male recipients and more female donors. If we look at ethnicity of our adult recipient and donors, so we can see in terms of living related and unrelated, HLA incompatible and ABO incompatible, that actually the split is fairly similar across donor and recipients. In terms of our non-altruistic donors, we see that in terms of our donor, the majority are white, whereas in terms of our recipients, we see more ethnic minority patients. In terms of paired donation, we see slightly higher ethnic minority patients in our recipient cohort, but we still do see them in our donors. If we look at age of adult recipients and donors, so in terms of our non-directed altruistic donors, we see more donors that are older. So there are 26% that are aged 60 to 69 and 11% aged 70 plus. In terms of our recipients, that's younger. Whereas in the other cohorts, we see a fairly similar age breakdown. And then in terms of sensitization, so this again is an indication how difficult you are to match. And those that are classed as 0 to 9, they have a low sensitization. They're more likely to be transplanted in the living related or unrelated category. Whereas through our paired donation scheme and our non-directed altruistic donors, we are able to transplant those more difficult to match patients. And that's a real success of the paired donation scheme. So the UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme has managed to transplant patients who may not otherwise have got a transplant through the deceased scheme or because they were incompatible with their donor. So moving on to look at information of patients including in the matching runs. So we have on average around 250 patients included in each matching run in the more recent years. We started with around 200. But what you can see in the blue bars is the existing patients. And so these patients are the ones that have been in multiple matching runs. And we're seeing around 200 existing patients now in each run. We still add an extra 80 or so patients on to every new matching run. If we look at the pairs included in the matching run, so looking at the different types, what you can see there is that consistently HLA-I is the most common type of pair to enter the scheme. In terms of our ABO incompatible, we're seeing more in the more recent years. But we do also have a number of patients that are HLA-I and ABO-I incompatible with their donor. What we have seen more recently is the introduction, as I mentioned, of our compatible pairs. And now we're seeing on average around 26 or 25 patients included in each matching run. And these pairs really help with our really difficult to match patients in the scheme. So although they are compatible and they can go ahead with their own donor, what they're doing by entering the scheme is benefiting themselves, as I said, because they could get a younger donor or a better matched donor, but also they're enabling us to transplant the more difficult to match patients. So looking at transplants identified through the scheme, so we're seeing more and more transplants being identified through the scheme. And actually in the October 19 run, 86 transplants were identified. In the early months, what you can see is that in the light blue bars, we had quite a high proportion of transplants not proceeding. So in terms, if we look back to April 2017, of the 75 transplants identified, 39 proceeded and only 36 did not. So nearly a 50-50 split. So Lisa Burnap and colleagues have been working really hard to try and reduce the number of non-proceeding transplants because it's unfair on all the pairs in the scheme if a transplant can't go ahead. And in the more recent matching runs, we see a much smaller number that don't proceed. So looking at chances of transplant by blood group, and this is where we have our donor ABO blood group compared to our recipients. And you can see there in blue, the number of pairs transplanted, so the first number, and the number of pairs entered into the scheme, which is the second number. And then in red is the proportion of those that receive a transplant. So what we can say is that if you have a donor that's blood group O and the recipient is blood group A, B or AB, you're more likely to receive a transplant in the scheme than perhaps somebody who has an AB donor and an O recipient. So looking at our non-directed altruistic donors in terms of the scheme. So as I mentioned, prior to 2018, altruistic donors could choose whether they donated to the waiting list or they donated into the paired scheme. And we can see that a large number of donors chose to donate direct to the waiting list. And the shame from this is that if you donate direct to the waiting list, then you're only enabling the one transplant. Whereas if you donate it direct into the paired donation scheme, we can enable 2 or 3 transplants, depending on whether it's a short altruistic donor chain or a long altruistic donor chain. And what you can see from 2018 and 2019, that half of all altruistic donors are now entered into the scheme and are enabling those extra transplants to go ahead. We still see some donors not going into the scheme, and that's because, for example, there's a high priority patient, as I mentioned before, there are no matches in the scheme, or it just really can't happen. In terms of antibody incompatible transplants, so the scheme, this is another success of the scheme. So antibody incompatible transplants were going ahead, but because now these patients have an option of going into the scheme and be getting a transplant that isn't incompatible, we're seeing reductions in the numbers performed that are incompatible. And actually in the 2019-20 financial year, only 37 went ahead. And the reason that we think that's a good idea is because of the graft survival and the patient survival. So if we look at 5-year graft survival, so I'll just talk through these. So this is a Kaplan-Meier chart, and it shows the percentage of survival at 5 years and over time. So in our orange line at the top there, that's our related donor. And in the blue dotted line is our unrelated donor, and that has the best survival. But then following that, we have our non-directed altruistic donor in the pink line, and we also have our paired exchange donor in the black line. And they have slightly poorer survival at 5 years, but it's still very, very good. And then finally, in the green line, we have our ABO incompatible donor, and in the yellow line, our HLA incompatible donor. And they have much poorer survival in comparison to the other groups. And so by getting a transplant through a non-directed altruistic donor or a paired exchange donor, it means the graft survives longer. In terms of our patient survival, we see a slightly different picture in terms of our non-directed altruistic donor being slightly lower, but that relates back to the age that I mentioned before. So all of this information is actually available on our OD2 website, and we've got a statistics and reports tab, and we have our organ-specific reports where there is a report specifically for living donation, and it goes into all these details. So in summary, for the UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme, it delivers effective kidney sharing across the UK. We have very good international reputation, and it's the largest national scheme in Europe with central coordination. And we maximise transplants and outcomes. And as transplant activity has increased, antibody incompatible transplant activity has decreased. So we're trying to continuously innovate and improve, and this is very much key to success. So just acknowledgements before I move on to some COVID data. So this is to acknowledge our NHS blood and transplant colleagues. So Lisa Burnett puts a huge amount of effort into this work, and we also have other statisticians and members of the team. Without the University of Glasgow, we were unable to perform any of these matching algorithms, and also with the transplant centres referring units and our kidney advisor group, but also to our donors who come forward, because without those, it wouldn't be possible. So moving on to some COVID-19 data. So this is a sad picture in a way compared to the previous figure that I showed. So this is now by calendar year, and we can see the really good activity that we had, and by calendar year this was starting to improve. And we did see a large number of altruistic and paired exchange donors in 2019. However, in 2020 the numbers dropped, and this is all due to COVID. So only 2 of the 4 UK living kidney sharing schemes were able to go ahead, but also the one that was performed in January and March, the numbers of preceding donors was limited. We also had living transplants stop between the 21st of March and the 27th of April. And this is where hospitals focused on their COVID-19 patients. In 2021, so this year, the January UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme matching run was not performed, but we are going ahead with the April UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme, and that's being run right as we speak. We're looking at the pre-matching run now, and the real matching run will happen next week. So fingers crossed we get some good matches in that matching run and the transplants do go ahead. But how has it affected deceased donation and transplantation? So just moving briefly aside, so these are our donors in the blue and our transplants in the black. And you can see it's not just living donation that was affected. Deceased donation truly dropped off in April. And we saw only 4 donors in 1 week with 8 transplants performed. Quite quickly, transplantation recovered, but as we moved into a second and third wave over the winter months, we saw transplant numbers fall. And now at the start of the year, we are starting to see increases in transplants as transplant centres are opening. So a very similar picture to living donation. One of the things that we've worked on, so we've published some analysis looking at SARS-CoV-2 infection and early mortality of waitlisting and solid organ transplant recipients in both the deceased pool and the living donation pool. So in terms of our cohort for analysis, we looked at just under 47,000 recipients with a functioning graft and all patients that were active on the waiting list in February. And looking at unadjusted analysis, so this is focusing on our kidney recipients. So what we found was that patients on the waiting list, so those on dialysis, they were more likely to test positive for SARS-CoV-2, 4.4% of the waiting list did, whereas only 1.4% of transplant recipients tested positive, including living recipients and deceased recipients. However, in terms of those deaths following testing positive for SARS-CoV-2, it was much lower for our waiting list patients than our transplant patients. So we undertook some multivariable analysis to see what factors affected whether you tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. And we found the type of organ. So if you were a liver transplant recipient, then you were less likely to test positive. If you were older, you were more likely to test positive. If you were in a BAME group, you were more likely to test positive. If you lived in London, you were more likely to test positive. If you'd had your transplant in the most recent 2 years, you were more likely to test positive. And if you were a recipient of a living donor, you were less likely to test positive. We also did some modelling looking at death after positive tests for SARS-CoV-2 and found that age group was the only significant factor. So patients that were older than 60 were more likely to die following a positive SARS-CoV-2 test on our registry than any other recipient. So I just want to finally point you to our new website. So this is nhsbt.nhs.uk/organ transplantation. And there's lots of resources here in terms of kidney transplantation, information for patients. It links to the charities and there's links to Give a Kidney. And so this is a great resource to get all the information that you need on transplantation. So just finally to acknowledge all the transplant units and other hospital staff and specialist nurses for organ donation for the provision of the data to the UK Transplant Registry, because without that and without patients contributing, we wouldn't be able to create these new schemes that help patients in the future. So thank you for listening and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I say it's fascinating to see the complexity built into the sharing scheme, both in terms of matching and the scoring algorithms. But I guess behind all that is also the delivery of the sharing scheme, and the fact that we've got I think it's 24 units in the UK, transplantation units, and coordinating all those to carry out the transplants from each run is another monumental task.
Yes.
Just the logistics of that, which is another area. One question that's come up and is the HLA, and I'm going to get the acronyms wrong now, so I'm not even going to try. But the incompatibilities,
Yes.
what do each of them relate to, and how does that impact on matching?
Yeah, so if we take ABO, incompatible, first, so that's the more easiest one. So in terms of ABO, that's your blood group. So if you're a blood group O, or your donor is a blood group O, sorry, then your donor can give to any of the blood types, O, A, B, or AB. Whereas if you're blood group B, for example, you can only accept a kidney from a donor that is blood group O or blood group B. So if you're a blood group B recipient and your donor is blood group AB, then you may not be able to receive the transplant from that donor. And so you become incompatible. So that's the donor ABO one. With the HLA one, it's a little bit more complicated. So HLA, everybody has a HLA type. And so let's take a really common one. So you could be HLA A2. Now, 50% of the population are HLA A2. If, for example, your donor is HLA A2, so they make up 50% of the population, but as a recipient, you've developed some antibody against A2, which means you can't receive that kidney. So what that means is that you then sensitized at 50% because you've knocked out 50% of the donors that you could possibly receive. So if your donor is A2 and you've developed an incompatibleness against A2, you can't then have that kidney. And the reason you develop incompatibility against an A2, there are several ways. So previous transplants. So in the past, if you've had a previous kidney transplant and the donor is A2 and you weren't, that means you build up antibodies to that. And that means that you can't then have that kidney. If you're pregnant and your partner, for example, carries the A2 and you don't, then you build up antibodies to that when you become pregnant. And another way is through blood transfusion. So if, for example, you receive blood from a donor that is A2 and you are not, then you will build up antibodies to that, and that then stops you from receiving.
Thank you for that. This is something, it may go beyond your, you're not a clinician, you're a statistician, but you may know the answer to this. The question is, I have a donor who's a zero match HLA. What is the benefit of going on the sharing scheme? I guess that's if you've got a zero score.
So the way we do the matching, so you would be a zero. So if you are a zero score, that means that you are fully compatible at A, B, and DR. So that means both your HLA types match. So in terms of that, then you're probably not going to get much benefit going into the scheme unless your donor is significantly older than you. And then you could get a better survival through having a donor that's younger. But in terms of if you are a 0-0-0, a perfect match, then you're probably not going to get any benefit going through. It's more for donor and recipients that match that say are a 2-2-2, which means they are incompatible at both loci at A, B, and DR. And we know that 2-2-2 transplants have much poorer outcome. So by going into the scheme to get a better match, you can improve your outcome, but also help another pair.
And I guess this is through the sharing scheme, is maybe that's what the graph is showing, but consequently, it should improve graft survival rates, shouldn't it? By having these better matches.
Yeah, if you get a better match at HLA or at age, then you can improve your outcome, which means your kidney lasts longer. And so the idea is when your kidney lasts longer, it means that you won't need to go back onto dialysis as soon. And also you're more likely, if you have a good match, not to develop antibodies, so that the second transplant that you might need, you can get easily because you're not difficult to match. So you've got a bigger donor pool.
Excellent, thank you. Interesting question about, you did mention the non-simultaneous donations. in chains, which sounds a bit intriguing. I wonder if you can expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, so non-simultaneous. So this is where, for example, so let's take two transplant centres. They may have different days where they're allowed access to their theatres. So hypothetically, let's take Cambridge and Oxford. And Cambridge can perform living donor transplants on a Tuesday or a Thursday, but Oxford can only do it on a Wednesday. So in order to allow that transplant to happen, what we do is we allow maybe a day between the donor and the recipient going ahead so that the transplant surgery can happen. Does that make sense?
It does. So the risk of simultaneous is that an event could occur that breaks the chain. Somebody could become unwell during that.
So
this is where
we try to limit it so that it doesn't happen. But in extreme circumstances, it can go ahead. And what we do is we try to protect the recipient. So if for any reason that doesn't happen, then that recipient gets prioritized into the deceased donor waiting list for the next available kidney that they are matched with. So yeah, we try and stop it from happening as much as we can, but inevitably in some cases that does have to happen. And so we let it go ahead in a managed way.
I think the incidences have been fairly rare, and they have been managed in each case. Could you explain how this priorities point system was worked out for waiting list patients? Were patients involved in the process?
So we wanted to try and keep the scheme as simple as possible because we're trying to match as many patients as we can in the scheme. But there are a lot of pairs that could be given advantage in the scheme. And so we can have multiple matches and we have to pick the best ones. So it's kind of a tie breakaway. So in terms of working out the best matches, so we give priority to people that have already been in the scheme because we don't want them to sit around. It's hard for them in the scheme. The more longer time you spend on dialysis, the more that can affect your survival. So we try and match you as quickly as possible. We try and limit the donor to donor age difference because, as I mentioned, if you have a much older donor with a younger recipient, that can impact on your survival. So we try and limit that. In terms of the match as well, like I mentioned, we try and limit the match. So we try and get better matches in the scheme because, again, it can impact on survival and we want the best outcome for our recipients. So that's how it was chosen. It was more clinical aspects, but then also running simulations of these schemes once we've put those points in place to see who are chosen and who are not, and is that the right decision. So it's monitored carefully and we always look into it to see if we need to alter it.
I think that there are a lot of patient groups that are involved in the various discussions. So I know the Kidney Forum, there's quite a lot of kidney groups, and as the schemes were being developed, these are things that were being discussed at meetings that we were having. So there's certainly input from patient groups in all of this as well, from personal experience anyways.
Yes.
When we asked the question about the 0 HLA, the person's come back and said, sorry, I made a mistake with the terms. I have no HLA match with my donor. Now, I don't know if that makes sense to you or not. I'm not quite sure what it means.
So in terms of a no HLA match, so that means you are a 222. So that means that your donor's HLA type will be completely different to your own. And actually you would then benefit from going into the scheme. So that the difference, I guess, so if we look at it two ways. So in the first way, if you don't go into the scheme and you take the match with your donor, it means that your survival might be less, but you can get a transplant immediately. There's no waiting around. The matching runs only happen once every 3 months, so there is going to be a delay and it can be all planned. Whether if you go into the scheme, then you are definitely going to get a better match. So we do not like 222 matches in transplantation. We actually exclude them from our deceased donor scheme. because that does mean that you will probably end up being a bit more sensitized in the future if you accept the donor. And so by going into the scheme, then yes, you might have to wait a little bit longer, but you will definitely get a better match. It will improve your survival and help you in the future if you require a second transplant.
Thank you, Lisa. You also referred to the change, I guess, around 2018, I think, where the default for altruistic donors was to go into the matching runs, and that's had a profound impact on the number of matches through the sharing scheme. So a question asks the question whether that should also be the default for pairs, for match pairs.
So I guess in terms of altruistic donation, unless there is a vital reason for an altruistic donor to wait, to not wait and have the transplant straight away, most of, from what we understand from charities like yourself, most donors are happy to wait a month or two to go into the scheme. And unless they've just missed a chain, then the likelihood is it will only be a month or two before the next chain is run. And so the benefit in terms of that is that they increase the number of transplants, but also that it's kind of scheduled around you, but you have to wait. In terms of compatible pairs, it's quite a difficult decision because it's I guess you have a transplant right there, you have a donor, you have the recipient, they can go ahead. And so I'm not sure it will ever be directed that they have to go into the scheme, but I think actually since around about 2018, more and more transplant centres are starting to encourage their pairs to do this because they can benefit more patients. And so if they are happy to wait, and even just to go into one matching run and see what happens, and if they don't, then they can go ahead with their transplant. I think it's more the encouraging message rather than an absolute.
Yeah, that seems to make sense. Going back to simultaneous donation, I don't know if you're aware, I mean, in the United States, I went over there and had a look at some of their schemes that they run. They actually have run a voucher system. So a grandfather knows that his granddaughter will need a kidney at some stage, but by the time she needs it, he may be far too old to donate and too unwell to donate. And so he can donate 20 years before the kidney's needed in a voucher. So that is an example of a huge delay in the transplant. But the numbers in the States are so much greater. They can usually find the matches when they need to. And I'm not sure in the UK whether we have the numbers that we could support that. But I thought I'd mention.
Yeah, so it has actually been raised in a lot of the advisory groups meetings about the scheme that happens in America, and I think it was felt that at this time, ethically, and the way that it may come across in the UK, that it wasn't the right thing to do. But it is, nothing's off the table. We always look to try and improve and enhance the scheme, and so that may come back round. But for now, it's not possible. Yeah,
more typically that scheme is used where somebody may be in the military service and they've only got a small window where they could actually donate, but their recipient's not ready yet. So that comes on to a question that's raised also about America, where are there any plans to extend the number of pairs in a chain, like in America, where they perform a chain with many pairs?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that we're looking at to see whether we can increase the number of pairs in the scheme, also whether we could increase the number of matching runs, or if we could, for example, if we have an altruistic donor chain, rather than that donor at the end donating to the waiting list, they wait and donate into the next matching run. So we're running simulations currently to see what benefit we may get from this, because if operationally it's too hard to manage and we might see chains fall down, and the benefit is only that we get an extra additional 1 or 2 transplants, it's not worth the risk. Whereas if we find that actually this could benefit a large number of patients, then we will look into it. So that's part of the new strategy that we're developing at NHSBT, and it will be looked at.
Yeah, I know it's always on the agenda, how far can we push this? And I guess from a Give a Kidney standpoint, we're always asking that question as well. There's another question that says, I work with renal patients in a renal support as a renal support worker closely. I rarely come across pairing scheme availability. I'm not quite sure what that exactly means, but would you say there's not enough information for patients, or the way it works is that some centers have better referral practices?
So I would say that there is quite a large number or amount of information out there, but whether people are directed to it is a different story. So we do a lot of work with our transplant centres, but we're relying on transplant centres to work with their renal centres and, for example, with Give a Kidney to promote this scheme. We can only promote it on our website and through our clinical colleagues. We don't have enough funding, as it were, to gain support on TV, radio stations, and so we're relying on word of mouth. And so I think we're looking at more ambassador programs. So we have donor ambassador programs that go out into schemes, into centres, and try and promote living donation and to promote the sharing scheme. And we're trying to work on that in the new strategy as well to get more information out there. But yes, it is difficult.
And I guess the other challenge is connecting with the BAME population and whether the sharing scheme is something. Has that had any impact on, I guess, the transplantation rate within the BAME community?
Yeah. So what we find is that in our BAME community, they're actually more likely to get renal failure compared to our white population. Not large amounts, but they are. And also we find that in our BAME community, they tend to be more difficult to match. So they have very rare HLA types, or they have had previous transplants or things like that. And so through the paired sharing scheme and the paired exchange scheme, we are managing to transplant more BAME. And so you would have seen from the chart I showed on ethnicity that in terms of recipients of altruistic donors and through the paired exchange, we see a lot more transplants in our BAME population because they're finding matches where otherwise they wouldn't have done. So what we're working as, again, with the donor ambassador programs, we're working in the BAME communities to try and share information and to try and encourage more BAME donors to come forward because they will help with their recipients.
That's good. That's encouraging, but I guess it's still an awfully long way to go, and I think we all know that, and there's a lot of us that are working to try and crack that particularly difficult nut. The sharing scheme, what it does is it creates a larger pool of numbers, doesn't it? That allows you to do all this matching. So there's a question about, can we expand that by going European wide? And I guess initially it would be with those countries that are receptive to non-directed donation and have their own sharing schemes, such as Netherlands and Spain, I guess. Are you aware of work along those lines?
Yeah, so in terms of the European collaborative that I mentioned, they are looking at whether we can have a pan-Europe sharing scheme. So we can look at trying, I guess we would prioritise within country matches, but where they were really difficult to match patients, we could then enable sharing across the two countries. I think at the moment it's just looking at between the Netherlands and the UK, because the Netherlands have a very good sharing scheme set up and they have a high rate of living donation in the Netherlands. So that's something that is on the table and being looked at to help these patients.
Seems to be there's an awful lot being done. There's an awful lot of work going on to expand this scheme, and to one of the barriers, as I see it, is the trusts. The trusts are the ones that actually have to carry out the retrievals and the operations for the recipient and for the donor, and trying to coordinate all that is difficult when each trust is a an entity unto its own. It has its own governance, its own management. And NHSBT is a coordinator of all of these things, but you don't have any control over how they go about it, or you have to do everything by influence and persuasion and argument, which has been very successful, but it does take time. But our system, this is, I think, a personal comment. I think that the way the NHS is organized it makes it more difficult and more time consuming to get change across a system than it would be if there was a single hierarchy. So that's another challenge, I think, in expanding the program.
Yeah, and I would just comment on that and say that actually at the moment it's quite difficult for our transplant units because unfortunately a lot of this work is done still via paper. And so that makes it even more challenging. And so what we're trying to do in NHSBT is to improve our IT systems to make it much easier and maybe try and even coordinate the transplant matches so that dates are already pre-arranged, because at the moment there's lots of phoning around between centres to try and arrange when the dates of the transplants will go ahead. And if we can try and take that away, then they'll have more time to care for the patients.
Yeah, excellent. Well, that's really great, Lisa. Thank you ever so much for presenting that for us and answering those questions. As I say, it is fascinating. There's it's a story that continues to be written, I think. COVID has had a serious impact and affected patients as it has affected patients in all sorts of conditions, but certainly with kidney transplantation. And it was so encouraging just before the outbreak of the pandemic that the numbers of non-directed donors coming forward, the non-directed operations was significantly up on the previous years. Hopefully we can return to those levels again. So I'd like to thank you once again and thank people attending. I'll just mention the event on the 22nd of May, which is Making a Match, which goes into this sort of in a different sort of angle from the how do we actually go about matching patients, in the donors and the recipients. So that's the 22nd of May. We're a charity, so if anybody would like to make a donation, and that's a financial donation rather than a kidney, you're always welcome to take a kidney as well. But that would help us in these difficult times as well. So as I say, the recording will be available shortly, and we'll send out an email giving the link. I don't think there's anything else from me, so I think once again, thank you ever so much, and hopefully we see everybody again virtually and hopefully in person before too long.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.